What would you do if someone tried to take credit for the hardest thing you've ever built? Not just the work, but the vision, the sacrifice, and the long, sleepless years behind it. Would you quietly step aside for the sake of family, of peace? Or would you stand your ground and risk becoming the villain in someone else's story? My name is Nina Morales. I'm 36, a licensed architect and founder of a small but growing sustainable design firm. But more than that, I'm someone who has spent the last decade proving that vision, not privilege, is what builds something lasting. 3 years ago, I designed and built my dream home in Boulder, Colorado, a self-sufficient townhouse carved into the edge of the hillside, powered by solar and rainwater, with panoramic views of the Rockies. It wasn't just shelter. It was a monument to everything I overcame: poverty, rejection, doubt, and the quiet dismissal that trails a woman of color in construction. But what I never expected was that someone I once called family would try to claim it all as theirs. Not just the bricks and beams, but the credit, the identity, and the legacy. And that's where this story begins. I didn't grow up in a world where dreams were encouraged. I was raised in the dry outskirts of El Paso, Texas, in a small rental behind a gas station. My father was a mechanic who taught me 2 things early on: how to change a tire and how to stand your ground. My mother passed when I was 9, and after that, it was just the 2 of us. Money was tight. The only blueprint I had for the future came from the walls of our living room: old National Geographic magazines and my dad's late-night stories about buildings he'd never seen in person. Used to sketch houses on the backs of receipts. Not dream mansions, just dignified places. Light-filled, safe, efficient, and warm. I remember saying once, "I want to build something the world can't ignore." And my dad looked up from his workbench and said, "Then you'd better learn how to do it twice as good and 10 times as hard." By the time I made it to college, I was already behind. No legacy scholarships, no family connections, just a partial grant and an absurd number of campus jobs. I studied architecture during the day and mopped university labs at night. I was told more than once, by professors and classmates, that my focus on sustainable design was too idealistic and commercially naive. But I didn't care. I wasn't trying to build for boardrooms. I wanted to build for people like my father, people who deserved beauty, efficiency, and respect in their homes. After graduation, I spent years bouncing from one male-dominated firm to another, each one barely tolerating my ideas, rarely inviting me to the big projects. I designed window details and staircases while watching less experienced men pitch full buildings. I learned to speak twice as clearly, work twice as fast, and take half the credit, because any more would seem ambitious. Eventually, I walked away from the conventional path and opened my own boutique firm in Denver. I took small clients at first: eco-conscious families, retirees who wanted off-grid cabins, community garden organizers. Every contract paid barely enough to break even, but I was gaining something no one could take: credibility. The townhouse project came later, after years of scrimping, saving, and living lean. I bought a sloped piece of land on the outskirts of Boulder, half the price because of its difficult topography. But to me, it was an open canvas. I poured everything into it. I sketched the first design by hand, then revised it over 80 times. I studied sun paths, rain patterns, soil density. I spent nights reading engineering reports and mornings at city planning meetings, making my case for green permits that hadn't even been used in that district before. The construction took 13 months. I hired local crews, oversaw every shipment, inspected every panel of reclaimed wood and triple-glazed glass. The roof captured water, the walls insulated with aerogel, the lights powered by passive solar capture. It wasn't just a house. It was my thesis, my rebellion, my quiet announcement that I was here to stay. When the last stone was set into the entryway, I cried, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. For the first time in my life, I had a space that reflected my values, my labor, and my future. A place that wasn't borrowed or temporary. A place no one could dismiss. I hosted a small celebration the day I moved in. Just a few colleagues and 2 old college friends. My father couldn't travel anymore by then, but I sent him a video tour. He wrote back one line. "You built what they said you couldn't. I'm proud of you, kid." Those words lived in my mind every time I walked through the door. And that's what made it all the more crushing when someone I'd once braided hair with, someone who used to sleep on my couch in college, stood in my foyer and told me the house wasn't mine anymore. It wasn't just about the walls. It was about every moment that had led to them, and that's why I couldn't walk away quietly. Not this time. It started on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before I was supposed to present the townhouse in an eco-design conference panel. I'd gone out early to pick up a custom frame for the architectural elevation prints I planned to display in the entryway. When I pulled into the driveway, something immediately felt off. A white luxury SUV I didn't recognize was parked out front. There were helium balloons tied to the fence, white and blush-toned, swaying gently in the breeze. I stepped out of the car slowly, confusion building in my chest like fog. As I approached the front door, I heard voices, cheerful, excited, echoing. From inside. I hadn't invited anyone. My father hadn't called. No delivery was scheduled. I stood at the threshold, hand hovering over the keypad. The smart lock blinked green. Someone had entered using an approved code. That someone was Isabella. I opened the door and was greeted with laughter, the scent of peonies, and a sharp jolt of disbelief. In my living room stood Isabella, my cousin, barely 21, wearing an ivory jumpsuit and gesturing like she was leading a tour. Beside her, a woman in heels was scribbling notes on a clipboard. 3 other women stood around, admiring the space, sipping what looked like sparkling wine out of plastic flutes. "Oh my God, Nina," Isabella squealed, like this was some sort of surprise party. "I didn't expect you back so soon." I stared at her, speechless. "What's going on here?" Isabella smiled, oblivious or pretending to be. "This is the venue. Isn't it amazing? I knew it would be perfect the second Grandma said she was giving me the house." I blinked. "Giving you this house?" She laughed. "Yeah, for the wedding. I mean, not just the ceremony. We'll live here after, too. It's symbolic. A fresh start. You know, since you're always traveling and barely live here." My chest tightened. "Isabella, this house is mine. I designed it. I built it. What are you talking about?" The wedding planner looked up, suddenly sensing the tension. Isabella brushed it off with a casual wave. "Grandma said everything's already been arranged. That since she helped with your startup loan, she technically owns part of it, and she decided to transfer it as a wedding gift." "I thought she told you?" I froze. My stomach sank. "Grandma?" I hadn't spoken to her in over a month. She'd helped me with an early $5,000 investment years ago. Small, symbolic even, but it never included co-ownership. She'd never once asked for a return. She'd called it a gesture of faith in the family's first architect. We'd always had a complicated relationship, but this crossed a line I didn't even know could be drawn. Isabella kept talking, explaining how the backyard would be tented, the rooftop would be the cocktail space, and she already had a Pinterest board going for the layout. My body remained still, but my mind raced. I noticed the details then. The folded wedding brochure on my dining table, the sticky notes on my kitchen cabinets, the makeup bag on my bathroom sink like someone had moved in overnight. Not just moved in, taken over. I finally interrupted. Her. "You need to stop. Right now. You can't just announce ownership of a house that isn't yours." She blinked, surprised by my tone. "Nina, relax. It's not a big deal. You're successful. You don't even want to get married. Everyone says you're too focused on work. This house is way too much for one person." A silence stretched between us, sharp and unbearable. Then she said it, casually, with the same sweetness she used to ask me for money in college. "Grandma said you'd understand. You've had your moment. Let someone else enjoy it now." It wasn't just entitlement in her voice, it was assumption. As if my accomplishments were communal property to be redistributed based on sentiment. As if my story had reached its expiration date. Then came the second blow. My uncle arrived, her father. He walked in like he owned the place, kissed her on the cheek and turned to me. "This is for the family, Nina. You should be proud. Isabella's starting something beautiful. And this house? It'll finally have people in it who value legacy." That word, legacy, landed like a slap. I'd built this home as the beginning of mine, and now they were trying to repurpose it as hers. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply stood taller. "Get out," I said. My voice was steady. Final. They stared at me like I'd lost my mind, but I hadn't. I was just finally seeing clearly. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a takeover, and they'd planned it all. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the couch in the living room, the one they'd nearly staged as a bridal photo corner, and stared at the ceiling, the soft amber light from the wall sconces casting long shadows across the timber beams. The same beams I had chosen from a reclaimed wood yard and sealed myself over 2 weekends. Now, I couldn't look at them without hearing Isabella's voice echoing in my head. "This house is way too much for one person." By morning, my phone had already begun buzzing. A series of messages came in like aftershocks. My aunt wondering if I'd been too harsh. My grandmother asking to talk calmly. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years texting, "Can't you just give the house? Family is more important than pride." Every one of them carried the same subtext. "You're selfish for saying no." Even my father, who had always been the only voice of reason in my world, called that afternoon. "Misha," he began gently. "Maybe just let them use the house for the wedding, temporarily. You know how Grandma is. She doesn't always communicate clearly." I didn't even recognize the disappointment I felt in that moment. I just nodded silently and ended the call. The ground was shifting under my feet, and no one seemed to notice I was the one being buried. But something wasn't sitting right. I kept replaying Isabella's words, especially the part about Grandma owning part of the house. That was impossible, wasn't it? I'd done everything by the book. When I went to dig out the deed, my hands trembled slightly. The envelope was still in my desk drawer where I'd placed it a year ago after the final property transfer. But as I flipped through the paperwork, my breath caught. Attached to the back of the deed was a stapled copy of a legal document I didn't recognize. It looked like a power of attorney form, granting Grandma authority over property-related decisions in the event of incapacitation or absence. Signed by me, but I'd never signed that. I looked closer. The signature was my name, written with believable strokes, but it was off. I'd used a different signature style for years. More tellingly, it was dated just 6 weeks ago, during the time I'd been traveling to San Diego for a design expo. Someone had accessed my files, my documents, possibly my email. I sat back, ice pooling in my stomach. This wasn't just an overreach or an assumption. This was fraud. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had quietly tried to transfer my authority. I opened my laptop and began reviewing login records. Sure enough, there was a failed login attempt from an IP address located in Santa Fe, where Isabella had been visiting last month. I hadn't noticed it at the time because nothing had seemed tampered with, but now the pieces began falling into place. Later that evening, I went into the kitchen and noticed a manila envelope on the counter that hadn't been there before. Inside was a printed wedding venue booking contract. I flipped through it and found the name Morales Residence, listed as the official event location. Below, in fine print, it listed, approval signature, Nina M. Morales, forged. Again. I stared at the page, this time not with shock, but with something colder. Resentment. Isabella hadn't just stepped over the line, she'd crossed into criminal territory. But what haunted me more than the forged signature was the growing chorus of voices telling me to just let it go. As if protecting my own name, my own home, was an act of hostility. By the weekend, word had spread. I stopped answering calls. I knew what they'd say. The same old lines wrapped in faux concern. Don't escalate. Think of the bigger picture. Be the bigger person. Even those who knew me well, friends who respected my work, were caught off guard by how personal it had all become. One friend even asked, "Are you sure you're not overreacting? I mean, it's just a wedding, right?" But it wasn't just a wedding. It was a rewriting of everything I'd worked for. It was entitlement dressed in tulle and white roses. And if I didn't draw the line now, there would be no boundaries left later. I decided to take action. I started by checking every single document tied to the house, from the first purchase offer to the final inspection receipts. I called my lawyer, Owen, and explained the situation. He asked for digital copies, then paused after I described the forged documents. "That's not just unethical," he said. "That's potentially criminal. If she's using your property, or your name for gain, you have grounds to file a civil injunction and maybe more." I asked him to begin the process immediately. That night, I stood on the rooftop terrace alone, looking down at the garden I'd landscaped myself. The rock. Pathways, the native grasses, the solar lanterns I'd installed one spring weekend while listening to jazz and drinking coffee. All of it now felt fragile, like glass held too tightly. But I wasn't going to let it break. Not this time. I would find out how far this lie went, and I would end it, no matter who stood in the way. By Monday morning, Owen called me with a tone in his voice I hadn't heard before, measured, cautious, but unmistakably serious. "Nina, I've reviewed the documents. That power of attorney was submitted through a legal firm in Santa Fe. It wasn't just forged. It was used to authorize third-party access to your property records through the county registrar's system." My fingers clenched around the phone. "Who filed it?" He sighed. "The filing trail leads to a limited liability company called Marisol West Developments. Registered last month by, get this, Isabella Grant. She listed herself as managing partner. And the listed project address? Your house." My heart dropped. I had assumed she was just being reckless, entitled, maybe manipulative. But this was no longer impulsive behavior. This was orchestrated, thought out, weaponized, and she wasn't doing it alone. I asked Owen to send me the documents. Less than 10 minutes later, my inbox pinged. As I scrolled through them, a sickening pattern emerged. Isabella had not only submitted the forged POA, she'd also used it to authorize a property appraisal, initiate zoning inquiries, and apply for a permit to build adjacent units on the property, none of which I had ever requested. The worst part? Attached to the LLC registration was a business proposal, a full PDF pitch deck for investors. I opened the file with growing dread. The front page featured a full-color rendering of my home, digitally modified and labeled as the prototype, for a new real estate initiative called Project Phoenix, Elevation Living for the Next Generation. Page after page showcased mock-ups clearly derived from my original plans, slightly altered but recognizably mine. She had even included bullet points describing cutting-edge water reclamation and solar integration, features directly lifted from my designs. Near the end of the deck, her fiancé was listed as a co-founder and head of business development. So, this wasn't just about stealing my house. This was a commercial scam built on my intellectual property and my name. My blood chilled. And yet, part of me wasn't surprised. I had always known Isabella was hungry for status. Her social media was a stream of borrowed aesthetics, staged yoga sessions in borrowed gear, captions about minimalism under photos of rented Airbnbs, and carefully edited images of her home renovation journey that were nothing more than her standing in front of stylish buildings she didn't own. But this time, she had crossed the line from pretending to producing, and she was using my work as the foundation. I immediately called Owen again. If she's showing this to investors, she's committing fraud. I know, he said, and I think you're going to want to sit down for this next part. He forwarded an email he had received from a concerned third-party investor. Woman named Julia Bain, based in Portland, had received Isabella's pitch through a mutual connection and decided to do some digging. Something about the language had felt too polished, too technical for a 21-year-old with no formal training. So she reverse image searched one of the blueprint slides, and it led back to my firm's portfolio site. She'd reached out, assuming this might be a joint project. But upon learning that it wasn't, she offered to send the email chain as evidence. Julia's final message included a screenshot of a private Zoom meeting invite titled Investor Preview, Tour of Prototype Residence, Boulder, CO. Date: Friday. Time: 2 p.m. 2 days away. They weren't just pitching this concept, they were showing it off, using my house, my home. I hung up and stared out the window, the late afternoon light casting long gold beams across my floors. It wasn't just an invasion anymore. It was an open performance, and I was the stage they were standing on. By that night, I had downloaded every shred of documentation into a secure cloud folder, contacted my security system provider to audit, access logs, and installed temporary interior cameras throughout the house. I also ordered the locks rekeyed and revoked all digital access codes that had ever been shared, even with close friends. Then I sat down, hands steady now, and began drafting a cease and desist letter, not just to Isabella, but to her fiancé, her LLC, and every known investor listed in the document. I included evidence of the forged signature, misappropriated designs, and pending legal ownership. At the end of the letter, I added one final sentence. This is your only warning. Step off my property, both literally and legally, or face the consequences. I sent it to Owen to deliver formally, through his office. The next morning, I didn't wait for a reply. I printed out everything, stored it in a hard drive and fireproof envelope, and dropped it off with a friend in law enforcement, because something told me this wouldn't end with a letter, and I intended to be ready. The moment I pressed send on the cease and desist packet, something shifted inside me. The hesitation, the fear of appearing unreasonable, even the sting of betrayal, all of it began to burn off like morning fog under sunlight. For the first time since Isabella walked into my foyer with wedding plans and entitlement dripping from her voice, I felt like myself again. Not just a homeowner under siege, but a builder, a strategist. A woman who had never relied on anyone to protect her, because she'd learned to protect herself. Owen filed an official ownership injunction that same afternoon, attaching all supporting documents, including screenshots of the forged power of attorney, the investor pitch deck, Julia Bain's email thread, and the registration of Marisol West Developments. We also submitted the original blueprints from my firm and the time-stamped project logs to prove creative authorship. The motion went to the Boulder County District Court under expedited status due to suspected fraud. Within 48 hours, we had a temporary restraining order in place. It didn't stop them from scheming, but it gave me legal standing if they pushed again. I didn't stop there. I activated every layer of protection I could think of. The smart locks were completely reprogrammed. I hired a private security firm to install motion-triggered surveillance on every exterior entry. I updated my insurance policy to include intellectual property clauses and construction rights. Then I sat down with my assistant, Maya, and went through every client project to ensure nothing else had been touched, stolen, or manipulated. She worked late into the night with me, cross-checking every file, every login, every shared folder. We found nothing else out of place, but by then, the damage had already been done. The day before the scheduled investor tour, I received a new email from a name I didn't recognize. It was one of the potential investors, apparently confused. The email was short. "Nina, I just wanted to double-check something. I was invited to view the prototype build for the Phoenix project at your residence tomorrow. Is this a real partnership with your firm, or is someone else using your materials?" Best, Gregory T.I. stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. I could have been emotional, accusatory, but instead, I answered with surgical precision. "Dear Gregory, thank you for your message. No, I am not affiliated in any way with the Phoenix project. Any use of my property, designs, or likeness has been done without my knowledge or consent. Legal action is already underway. I advise you to exercise caution moving forward. Respectfully, Nina Morales, founder and lead architect, NM Studio. Within 20 minutes, Gregory wrote back, "Thank you. Consider me out. This is troubling, but not everyone would walk away so easily." I had no doubt Isabella would go through with her presentation the next day. That wasn't just her ego, that was her pattern. When caught, she didn't retreat. She doubled down, so I planned accordingly. That Friday morning, I dressed in black slacks and a charcoal blazer, hair pulled back clean and sharp. I didn't plan to be dramatic. I planned to be unshakable. I installed a GoPro above the entryway, synced all surveillance to cloud backup, and sent real-time access to Owen and a friend in the sheriff's department. If Isabella or her team stepped 1 foot inside my property line, I would have more than just outrage. I'd have evidence. At 1:46 p.m., the first car pulled up, a sleek black sedan. 2 men stepped out, dressed in casual business attire. They checked their phones, glanced at the house, then walked toward the front gate. At 1:51, Isabella's SUV arrived. She stepped out wearing a blazer dress and holding a leather portfolio. Her fiancé followed behind, hands full of flyers. I watched them from the upstairs reading room, completely silent. When they reached the front gate, Isabella confidently tapped in a code, the old one. The gate didn't budge. She tried again. Nothing. Then she rang the call box. I didn't answer. She tried again, now visibly annoyed, waving her hand at the camera like I was being unreasonable. The third time, I answered. "Isabella," I said, voice calm. "This property is under legal protection. You are violating a court-ordered injunction by attempting to access it. Please leave immediately." She laughed. "Nina, stop being dramatic. This is a business tour." "You do not own this house," I said, "and you are committing fraud by presenting it as part of a project you fabricated. I've informed law enforcement and my legal team. Everything is being recorded. This is your final warning." There was a long pause. I could see her weighing the options. The investors looked increasingly uncomfortable. Her fiancé whispered something to her, but she shook her head and raised her voice. "You can't prove anything. Grandma said you gave us permission. We have witnesses." "Isabella," I said again, quietly this time, "there are timestamps, signatures, emails, surveillance footage, and IP logs. The law is on my side. If you walk away now, it may still be salvageable. If you don't, this becomes a criminal case." She hesitated. For the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face. Then she turned, grabbed her fiancé's arm, and barked something to the investors, something vague and dismissive. They looked unconvinced. One of them walked away without another word as the last car pulled off. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began uploading the day's footage to Owen. She'd walked away from the gate, but I knew better than to think this was over. She hadn't surrendered. She was regrouping, and so was I. The day after the investor confrontation, my inbox was unusually quiet. No follow-ups, no more veiled threats from extended family. It was as if the whole thing had paused, stretched thin in the air like a held breath. But I didn't feel relief. I knew Isabella too well. Silence for her never meant retreat. It meant she was pivoting, re-strategizing, and that was far more dangerous than an open attack. That evening, I received a call from my grandmother. Hadn't spoken to her directly since the first confrontation. I'd expected anger or indignation, perhaps a defensive lecture about family unity. But when I picked up, her voice startled me. It wasn't furious. It was small, shaky. "Nina," she said, "can you come see me?" She lived in a senior living complex about 20 minutes outside Boulder, a quiet place with wide porches and a view of the foothills. I hadn't visited in over a month. Part of me hesitated, unsure of whether I was walking into reconciliation or manipulation. But curiosity, no, something deeper, maybe loyalty, pushed me out the door. She was sitting on the patio when I arrived, wrapped in a knitted shawl, a cup of tea trembling slightly in her hand. Her face had aged even in the few weeks since I'd last seen her. Lines etched deeper, her expression softer, more uncertain. "I didn't know, Nina," she said as I sat across from her. "About the document, the power of attorney. Isabella brought it to me to sign. She said you were too busy and asked me to help move some things forward on your behalf. I thought I was just helping with your permits." My pulse slowed. "She didn't tell you what it really was?" She shook her head, eyes glossy now. "She said she was working on a surprise, a joint family project, something to honor your work. She made it sound so generous." I said nothing at first, just listened. The weight of it all settled like a thick blanket across my shoulders. "I should have asked," she whispered. "I should have known better." But I wanted to believe she'd turned a corner. I looked at her and saw, for the first time, not a matriarch, not a co-conspirator, but a grandmother who'd been used, who wanted so badly to believe in her granddaughter's redemption that she hadn't paused to question her role in someone else's downfall. Then she reached beside her and handed me an envelope. "She asked me to mail this to a bank," she said. "I never did. Something felt off." I opened it. Inside was a notarized form, unsigned, authorizing a transfer of partial ownership of the house to Marisol West Developments, my house, my name, and a forged digital signature field marked "Pending Final Review." I exhaled, steadying the shaking in my fingers. She hadn't finished it, but she'd come close. "I'm sorry, mija," my grandmother said, her voice barely audible. "I never thought she'd go this far, but I also didn't protect you when I should have. I let the family's expectations get in the way of your truth." We sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the wind through the aspens. I didn't know what to say. There was no dramatic forgiveness, no tidy resolution, just a quiet, reluctant kind of peace. I reached out and held her hand. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. Before I left, she gave me one more thing, a flash drive Isabella had accidentally left on her desk during one of her visits. "I don't know what's on it," she said, "but I thought you should have it." That night, I plugged it in. Inside were dozens of folders, project proposals, forged email threads, even photo edits of my house made to look like luxury listings. But one folder stood out: Contracts, Pitch to Dawero. Inside, it was a file labeled Investor Presentation Final, recorded Zoom.mp4. I clicked play. It was a full investor pitch meeting, recorded and presented by Isabella and her fiancé, claiming full creative and legal control over the prototype property in Boulder. They spoke confidently, even showing falsified permits and referencing support from senior family members. My grandmother was even mentioned as board advisor. Paused the video. That was it. That was the nail. This wasn't just familial overreach or petty entitlement. It was fraud, manipulation, and coordinated identity theft. And now, with my grandmother's statement and the digital evidence in hand, I had everything I needed to take this further. What I felt wasn't victory. It was clarity. She hadn't just tried to take my home, she'd tried to steal my name, my work, my legacy, and now she'd be facing something I'd spent my life building: consequences. The next morning, I met with Owen in person for the first time since everything began. We sat across from each other in a small, unassuming office just outside downtown Boulder. The walls were lined with case files, real estate codebooks, and framed certifications. I handed him the flash drive without saying a word. I didn't need to. The look on my face said enough. He plugged it in, loaded the video, and as Isabella's voice echoed through the speakers, confident, performative, full of audacity, his brow furrowed into something between disbelief and professional fury. "We don't just have a case now," he said when the video ended. "We have leverage." She presented this as a real investment opportunity using forged documents, stolen designs, and your family as credibility padding. This is wire fraud, securities, fraud, identity theft, maybe even conspiracy to defraud. I nodded. I want to move forward, whatever it takes. By the afternoon, Owen had contacted the district attorney's office and submitted a formal complaint with the Colorado Department of Regulatory Agencies. The evidence package now included not only the forged power of attorney and false investor documents, but also testimony from my grandmother, the intercepted letter to the bank, and the investor Zoom recording. Everything was now corroborated, documented, and time-stamped. That night, I received an alert from my security system, motion detected at the side entrance. I opened the feed, half expecting another delivery or maybe even just a bird tripping. The sensor. It was Isabella. She stood there in a long camel coat, her phone pressed to her ear, glancing nervously toward the gate camera. Her fiancé hovered behind her, carrying a rolled-up set of prints. A car waited at the curb. It wasn't over. She hadn't learned. She was trying again. I didn't go outside. I didn't yell or confront her. I simply tapped a button on my phone and sent the alert directly to the local police contact Owen had coordinated with. Then I forwarded the footage to our case file with the subject line: Violation of Restraining Order, 8:37 p.m. 20 minutes later, flashing lights lit up my street. This time, I watched from behind the glass as officers approached. One of them asked, "Are you Isabella Grant?" I couldn't hear her answer, but I saw her face. The exact moment she realized she had crossed a line that wasn't going to be wiped away with charm or crocodile tears. They didn't handcuff her right away, but they escorted both her and her fiancé to the cruiser and placed them in the back seat. The officers knocked on my door, confirmed my identity, and gave me a brief nod. "We'll be filing this under trespassing and possible fraud activity. The DA's already reviewing the materials your attorney submitted. You've done everything." "Right, Ms. Morales." I thanked them quietly as the car pulled away. A week later, I was called to testify. The court hearing wasn't flashy. No grand jury, no packed gallery, just a judge, a few court staff, and 2 attorneys. But when Isabella was led in, her expression said everything. She looked hollow. Less like the overconfident schemer I'd seen on the Zoom call and more like someone who had finally begun to understand that actions have weight. She tried to speak. Her lawyer nudged her to stay quiet. She looked at me once, briefly. There was no apology, no remorse, just the familiar gleam of entitlement struggling to hold its breath. Owen presented our evidence cleanly, concisely, no embellishment needed. The facts stood on their own. By the end of the session, the judge approved our injunction for permanent ownership protection and referred the fraud and identity theft charges to the county prosecutor's office. She would be formally investigated, and depending on the findings, she could face a criminal trial. Her fiancé, listed as a co-conspirator, would also be subject to financial scrutiny for involvement in investor solicitation. As I walked out of the courthouse into the crisp Colorado air, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I hadn't burned bridges. I hadn't sought revenge. I had defended my name, my work, and my home, with truth, law, and unshakable clarity. And now the story was no longer hers to tell. It was mine. The weeks after the court hearing passed in a strange sort of quiet. Not silence exactly, but something calmer, like the stillness that follows a storm, when the air is heavy with the scent of turned earth, and you're not sure if what you feel is relief or just the absence of chaos. I spent most of that time reorganizing my studio, sorting through months of backlogged design projects, updating my client roadmap. There was peace in the routine, in recalibrating. The headlines never broke nationally, but local real estate networks picked up the story. A few blogs ran with it. Architect Foyle's family fraud scheme involving high-tech home. The attention was neither overwhelming nor intrusive. If anything, it created clarity. Clients who had been waiting on the sidelines reached out, not just out of curiosity, but because they saw something they respected in how I handled it. Not rage, not spectacle, just resolve. One woman, a single mother launching a community housing project, told me during our consultation, "When I read what you went through, I thought, finally, a woman who didn't back down just to make other people comfortable." That stuck with me. The firm grew faster than I'd planned. 2 new contracts came in before the spring. One for a solar-integrated artists' colony in northern Arizona, and another for a partnership with an environmental nonprofit aiming to convert unused lots into green-accessible housing. It felt surreal at first, to go from fighting for the basic right to keep what I built to now helping others build with purpose. I also made a quiet decision to start something personal, the Sol Foundation, a small grant and mentorship program for young women of color in architecture and sustainable construction. I launched it in honor of my grandmother, who passed away quietly just 3 months after the confrontation. Her name was never cleared in public, but I knew the truth. And, in the end, she did too. She left me a letter in her will. A handwritten note, full of regret, full of love, with one line that I still read when I need grounding. "You built something the rest of us couldn't see coming. I'm sorry it took me too long to see it." I hosted a small memorial for her, at my home. Not the dramatic kind. Just a few people, some old photos, lavender tea, and the jazz music she used to hum while ironing. That day, my father sat beside me on the patio as the sun lowered over the foothills. We hadn't spoken much during the legal battle. He had pulled away when it got complicated. But now he reached for my hand and said quietly, "You were right to fight for it, and I was wrong to ask you not to." I didn't cry. I just nodded, letting the forgiveness exist in the space between us. By summer, the house felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. Every corner held a memory of resistance, and yet none of it felt heavy anymore. I had replaced the locks, repainted the entryway, and redesigned the landscaping to include native flowering vines. One evening, while watering the plants, I caught my reflection in the glass panels and realized I no longer saw someone who had to defend herself. I saw someone who had claimed herself. That fall, I gave a talk at a university design lecture series. I didn't speak about lawsuits or family drama. I spoke about ownership, not just of property, but of voice, of vision, of the right to say, "This is mine," and you don't get to rewrite my work because it makes you uncomfortable. As I stepped off the stage, a student stopped me and said, "You didn't just build a house, you built a boundary." And maybe that's what it all came down to, in the end. A house with walls no one else could walk through without knocking. A life, finally lived on my terms. Success isn't just about reaching a goal. It's about protecting what you've built from those who believe they're entitled to it simply because they know your name. Nina's story isn't rare, but what makes it powerful is the way she responded, with boundaries instead of bitterness, and with action instead of apology. In today's world, especially for women, especially for people building without a safety net, the idea of saying no, even to family, is still seen as rebellion. But maybe it's not rebellion. Maybe it's maturity. Maybe it's clarity. What Nina did wasn't about vengeance. It was about restoration. It was about refusing to let her silence be mistaken for consent. And in that refusal, she reminded us of something essential. Being strong doesn't mean being cruel. It means being clear, being consistent, and knowing what you will never again let slide. Because if you don't protect the life you've built, someone else will come in and claim it. One signature, one excuse, one sweet lie at a time. So here's a question for you. Have you ever had to defend what was yours, even when no one else stood with you? Share your story in the comments. We read every one. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. There are more voices like Nina's that deserve to be heard, and they start right here.